A friend of mine sent me a link to an article a couple of weeks ago by that venerable publication on policy discourse, Fast Company. It was a profile piece about American artist and creative entrepreneur Janelle Monáe. And the corporate structure that she has created around herself to be able to manage her business as a creative enterprise. And it was very interesting in terms of how she talked about, the team around her talked about what exactly it was that their business was and what they were trying to achieve. She actually met this collective of people when she was at college, before, in fact, she even had really engaged with her own practice as a musician. And this group of people were engaged in an art collective, looking at different ways of exploring their practice in terms of socially engaged practice, but also activism as well. As you can imagine, there's probably a fair amount of that going on in college campuses around the world. When she started to break through as a musician, she formed the Wonderland Art Society with this group of people. And it's very interesting how they conceive of what it is that they do. It's not so much thinking about Janelle as an artist, first and foremost as a musician who has bolted on other tricks in her bag, if you like, put other bats in her, other clubs in her bag as she has developed as an artist. It's more a holistic conception of a way of commercialising the intellectual property of Janelle's artistic vision. And as you can see from that quote from Mikhail Moore, who's the managing director of Wonderland Art Society, it's a completely integrated idea about how Janelle actually engages with the marketplace through her art and through her vision. And I'll come back to them in a little bit in a minute. But other than this being very interesting, what snagged my attention about this piece was that I found myself wondering where a creative entrepreneur like this would see themselves in the policy landscape for creative industries, particularly if this was a creative entrepreneur that we had grown here in Australia. Would they see themselves reflected in the innovation system? Would they see themselves reflected in our cultural policy? Would they see themselves reflected in any of the other strategies and initiatives that public policy tries to enact to encourage these types of creative enterprises to come into being and to be successful? And so with that, I started to, as Terry asked me to do, I started to think about, well, what is the context in which we are sort of operating for creative industries in Australia? So at the federal level, we have a quite diffuse, expression of policy instruments that relate to creative industries. Certainly we see some allowance for creative industries in our National Innovation Science Agenda. However, welcome to the ideas boom boom. As with many innovation policies, this is largely science and technology driven. It certainly does encourage a closer engagement between research organisations and industry, but it is coming from a STEM framework. We also have seen a range of attempts over the last few years to engage with reform around copyright. And we've also seen some inquiries and some reports from the Productivity Commission looking into different sort of aspects of copyright industries to not many degrees of success, one could argue. And we haven't seen a whole lot of innovation in the cultural policy space, with perhaps the notable exception of the momentous work done nationally to develop a new national cultural policy that was released in 2016 by a minister who the very next day, I think it was actually out of a job. And a mere number of months later, we had a change of government, and so that policy never really had the opportunity to take flight. Of course, we have some expressions of or allowances for creative industries in other diffuse places, education and training arguably. Some, I wouldn't say policy work, but it's at least sort of, strategy and activities and interests from organisations like DFAT, looking at possible uses of culture as a sort of soft power strategy, and starting to sort of see its place in cities and regional economy strategy as well. But what we don't have at the national level is the idea of creative industries as a policy concept that is cohesive. At the Queensland level, it's a somewhat similar story, but perhaps a little bit more optimistic. And I think that that's partly owing to the fact that Queensland has got a significant recent history of intensive policy development and policy entrepreneurship around developing a knowledge economy for Queensland, of which creative industries has been a very conscious and concerted part. And that sort of goes back to the days of the late 90s when we started to see the creativity as big business strategy as part of the Smart State initiative. But fast forward to the present day, and what we are seeing is avenues for creative industries in our innovation policy, mainly the Advanced Queensland Initiative, where there are some specific initiatives in there that are for creative programs, particularly Creating Queensland, which is a very small but I think notable support program for YouTube creators and online content creators. And quite recently, just in the last couple of weeks, we've had the Queensland Government release before I get to that, I should say that under the Advanced Queensland Initiative, we had a specific 10-year roadmap for screen industries. And also quite recently, a discussion paper released for a 10-year strategy for arts, culture and creative industries as well. And all of this is in the context of a larger Queensland Government push for particular priorities that it sees as the big challenges that it wants to tackle over the longer term. So these are the Advancing Queensland Priority Strategy, and there are 5 which I've put up there on the slide. And I think that's important to note only because we're currently 2 years out from the next state government election, and at the time the winner of that particular election will hold government for 4 years, and we will move to a fixed term electoral cycle. So any government that isn't particularly talented at getting itself thrown out after one term, and obviously we have had recent examples of that in Queensland, will have, in something like this type of policy framework, a 10-year horizon, approximately, to be able to advance some of these things. And I think that's important because what I think we're seeing with some of the release of these new longer-term roadmaps is a slightly longer vision from state government and an appetite for looking beyond the 3-year, or what has been a 3-year electoral cycle, to try to move the needle on some of these bigger social issues and economic challenges for the state. So what are we seeing in terms of what's common in some of the policy policy signals that are being put out by governments at both state and federal level? Well, one of the things that we're seeing is a very concerted and conscious effort to keep cultural industries and creative industries coupled together. I noted that Stuart mentioned a possible way forward for creative industries, policy and certainly for research is to think about a conscious decoupling of research, categorisation, measurement of cultural policy as opposed to creative industries policy. And he espoused that in more detail with his co-author Hassan Bakshi in his Nesta Provocation from a couple of years ago. But what we're seeing from a lot of the documents that are being released, particularly at state level for arts and cultural agencies, is that they're very much determined to keep creative industries in the mix and in the categorisation. We're also seeing, alongside that, a broadening out of the impacts and the outcomes that we're looking for from such policies, from economic to also include social impact. And social impact outcomes have really found a much more specific articulation in some of the documents that have been released. So this is a quote here from the current discussion paper that Queensland Government has put out for their arts roadmap. But we're also seeing it in other state governments as well. So this is a graphic from Creative State, which was Creative Victoria's policy that they put out a few years ago. And they have made a very specific allowance for social impact indicators as part of their policy. They've even put crime prevention up there as one of the outcomes that they expect to be able to achieve through arts and culture and through creative industry strategy and engagement, which I think is a very, while we've always had, I think, social indicators or social aspirations for arts and culture, we're really seeing a much more specific and articulate definition of that in these policies. The other sort of language that we're starting to see at both state and federal level and even internationally is this idea of a joined up sort of policy, a joined up way of working, a policy for cultural industries and for creative industries that takes account of this diffuse environment we have for policy across creative industries. How do we bring the strategies for cultural industries and for creative industries into dialogue with education, with health, with the innovation system, with intellectual property strategies, all of those sorts of things that were mentioned at the start. So, against this framework, the question that I want to ask is what policy role can there be or should there be for a faculty like ours? And I think the other sort of question, I guess, that goes with that is how should we approach it? What are the avenues for a faculty like ours to be an active participant in the policy conversation? One is the idea of the policy entrepreneur. And this is an idea that was really first proposed by Kingdom when he was writing about the American policy process. And he proposed that there were sort of three streams when it comes to the policy process. There's the problem stream, the political stream, and the solution stream. And a window of opportunity or a policy window opens up when these three streams come into alignment. And what a policy entrepreneur does is they kind of lie in wait for these windows of opportunity to emerge, and then they strike. So policy entrepreneurs tend to be people that have the ability to marshal coalitions and consensus around an idea or a narrative, even when there isn't that window of opportunity available, so that when they have the ability, when that moment does arrive, they have the resources, they have the buy-in, and they have the opportunity to be able to move it forward. The other idea that is worth thinking about borrows its framework from complex adaptive systems. And certainly what we're seeing, I have been seeing since mid-20th century, is the borrowing of evolutionary theory and concepts in humanities and social policy. And this has found quite sophisticated methodologies now in a range of social policy areas where policymakers are looking to come together around really wicked social problems like homelessness, climate change, etc. So this diagram here is a diagram from the Centre for Social Impact at University of New South Wales, which proposes a way of thinking about the components of tackling social change in a systems framework. What I think is interesting about these two different approaches is that when you look at what are the things that make those approaches successful, they have a lot of things that they share in common. So successful policy entrepreneurs, for example, are organisations or people or groups who are able to frame problems and redefine policy solutions. They are people with a good story to tell about what the problem is and how to fix it. They are able to use networks and expand them. They are able to cross boundaries and work in a very collaborative way. They are very good at guiding a coalition towards a consensus. They lead by example, so they are often organisations who are prepared to put some risk on the line to demonstrate that solutions can work. And they are also good at building momentum to scale up change efforts. System leaders are people with similar sets of skills. So they are people who are able to diagnose the system and to measure it. And for most people that look at system change methodologies, this is one of the key initial pieces of system change that have to take place before the rest of the methodology can unfurl. We have to understand what is the problem that we're trying to tackle, and we need to be able to learn about our process as we go. So that measurement and that evaluation piece is critical. System leaders can engage people across boundaries. They manage up, out, down across organisations, sectors and schools of thought. They co-design solutions with end users and system participants. They are good at storytelling, and they balance their advocacy with inquiry. So not only is there a lot of commonalities there, but what struck me about these elements is that they very much describe some of the things that Gavin was talking about when he was talking about the competencies that we are looking for when we are thinking about graduating students into successful long-term careers and futures in the creative industries. I don't have a provocation in terms of how which one of those we should pursue, or even whether or not we should pursue them. However, I would point out that as to why we might wish to pursue it, purely on the goal of self-interest. Aligning as we must now to a national framework for research, engagement and impact. These are things that can really help us to understand how we think about end users, how we think about system participants, and in fact our role as a system participant, and the ways in which we can engage across the policy space to be able to have a say in shaping that environment and that future. And that isn't much different really when I think about what Janelle Monáe is trying to do with her creative entrepreneurship. Thank you.